The Americans with Disabilities Act, also referred to as ADA, was passed by Congress in 1990. The purpose of the law is to make it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. The law is broad and was designed to protect individuals from discrimination in many areas of life through 5 titles. Let us quickly review each of the titles and then we will discuss further in detail Title 3. The first title is Employment. The law wants people to have the same opportunities for people with disabilities in the workplace. Therefore, the law makes it so employers must provide reasonable accommodations to the disabled. This can include making changes to certain policies, in addition to altering the office space to accommodate the person with the disability. This part of the law is both regulated and enforced by the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. State and local governments. Title II prohibits discrimination of the disabled in programs and public entities provided by state and local governments. State and local governments must also make a reasonable modification to their programs to avoid discrimination. Title III of the law is focused on public accommodations. This section aims to prevent discrimination in places that are owned or leased privately but are open to the public, such as a restaurant. This is an important section that we will focus much of the chapter on and how it relates to alterations that must be made to commercial properties. Title III is regulated and enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice. Title IV of the Act focuses on telecommunications. It requires telecommunications providers to ensure that people who have hearing and speech disabilities are able to communicate over the phone across state lines. It also requires there be closed captioning on any public service announcements that are federally funded. Title IV is regulated and enforced by the Federal Communication Commission. Finally, Title V contains a variety of provisions relating to the ADA as a whole. This section covers items such as state immunity, insurance provisions, along with design and construction standards. It also spells out the relationship between ADA and various state and federal laws. It is also illegal to discriminate against the disabled on transportation. Under the ADA, if it is public transportation, it is addressed and enforced under Title II. If it is transportation managed privately, it is considered a public accommodation and will fall under Title III. As an agent, it is not critical for you to have an in-depth understanding of each title of the Act. As we mentioned, we will be focused on Title III of the Act. While the ADA is not part of the Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing Act was amended in 1998 to include people with disabilities as a protected class. This change helped give birth to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, we will take a moment to review who is protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. In order to qualify as having a disability under the Act, one must be one of the following: a person who has a physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activities, a person who had a record of an impairment that limits one or more major life activity, a person regarded as having an impairment that limits one or more major life activity. While the law is designed to protect the disabled in many areas of public life, for our purposes, we will focus on the public accommodations. Public accommodations apply to any private business or nonprofit that is open to the public and offers the sale or lease of goods and services. Specifically, the Act spells out 12 categories of public accommodations. Let's take a moment to review the individual categories. Places that serve food or drink. Places that offer lodging. This could be a hotel, but also places like a campground. places that offer entertainment or exhibition. Places of public gathering. This could be a private outdoor garden space that is open to the public. Sales or rental establishments. This category would include your real estate brokerage office. Service establishments. Places that offer public displays or collections. A privately owned art gallery would fall into this category. Stations that are used for public transportation. Places of recreation. Places of education. Places that offer social service programs. And places of exercise. Your local gym must comply with the ADA. The ADA does not take into consideration the size of the business. Even the smallest privately owned company must comply. There are two exemptions under Title III of the ADA, and those are religious organizations and private clubs. Now we will take a moment to review exactly what is required under the Act for entities that are considered public accommodations. Essentially, the law states one must make reasonable accommodations to their practices and policies in order to make their goods and services available to people with disabilities. So, what exactly does this mean? The law has three very broad principles that include equal opportunity to participate, equal opportunity to benefit, and finally, one must be given the equal opportunity to receive the benefit in an accommodating setting. The party with the public accommodation must be willing to adjust the following in order to adhere to these principles. The entity must be willing to modify its practices and policies to create equal opportunity. The entity must be willing to provide auxiliary aids and services to create equal opportunity. And finally, the entity must be ready to remove architectural barriers in the building to create equal opportunity. The Act requires that a public accommodation must adjust itself in order to ensure people with disabilities can participate. The adjustments made cannot create an undue burden on the entity. In addition, the modifications cannot change the fundamental nature of the goods and service provided. For example, an art gallery should provide a tour guide who uses sign language to accommodate a group of deaf visitors. Now we will take a moment to review some of the more common architectural barriers that must be modified for the disabled. Parking spaces can often be too small to accommodate people with wheelchairs. Many businesses remove this barrier by offering handicapped parking spots. Steps to enter a store or steps in the store. Businesses can add a ramp to easily accommodate a wheelchair. There are also guidelines in order to make bathrooms accessible. The first item is installing a grab bar. The ADA requires a grab bar be fully anchored with a smooth surface that can be easily grabbed. Grab bars for accessible bathrooms must also be installed between 34 and 38 inches off the ground. Finally, in order to make sure the bar can be easily grabbed, there must be at least 1.5 inches between the bar and the surface it is attached to. In addition, the accessible bathroom must allow at least one wheelchair to freely rotate in the space. This typically means a width of at least 60 inches. The ADA also requires that doors be wide enough to accommodate wheelchairs. All ADA-compliant doors must be at least 32 inches wide. Clearance around the door must be at least 36 inches. There are a few properties that are exempt from the ADA. Those properties are properties that are considered historically significant. If the property is on the register or is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places or is designated as historic under local or state law, it will be exempt from making changes under the ADA. If the removal of the barrier would destroy the historical significance, then the modification does not need to be made. This does not mean, however, the business could not provide a video tour for people who are unable to access the property due to a disability. It's also important to note that there are different standards for newer and older buildings. For older buildings, the barriers must be removed if the changes are considered readily achievable. The readily achievable standard is looked at on a case-by-case basis, but overall, it means the change can be made easily without a major expense. All new buildings must be built to be readily accessible and usable to people with disabilities. There are a few exceptions to this standard for new construction. The only exceptions would be if the land had unique characteristics that made it not feasible. However, that exception is exceedingly rare. The ADA also applies to new residential buildings that are defined as a building ready for occupancy after March 31st, 1991, has an elevator, and more than 4 units. The ADA requires these residential buildings to provide the following: public and common areas that are accessible to persons with disabilities. Doors and hallways must be wide enough for wheelchairs. In addition, individual units must have the following: an accessible route into and through the unit, accessible light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls, reinforced bathroom walls to allow later installation of grab bars, and wheelchair-accessible kitchens and bathrooms. While the ADA is a comprehensive act, the requirements discussed in this lesson are some of the more fundamental requirements you need to know as a practicing real estate agent.